For most people today, Sun Tzu exists as a meme more than a thinker. His name is attached to motivational posters, startup culture quotes, and simplified slogans about dominance, competition, and victory. He is treated as a philosopher of battlefields, a master of aggression, a mystical strategist whose words promise success to anyone bold enough to apply them. But this popular image misses the real Sun Tzu almost entirely. Because when you strip away the slogans, the cherry-picked quotes, and the modern myth-making, you uncover something far more unsettling and far more relevant. Sun Tzu was not obsessed with winning wars. He was obsessed with avoiding them. He was not interested in glory, conquest, or heroic sacrifice. He was interested in cost. And in a world tearing itself apart through endless warfare, Sun Tzu became one of the first thinkers in history to articulate a truth that still governs global power today. The greatest threat to a state is not the enemy standing across the battlefield, but the bill that arrives after the fighting stops. People assume the art of war is about combat. In reality, it is about finance. It is a manual on how not to bankrupt your nation while trying to protect it. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand Sun Tzu's financial genius, you must first understand the world that produced him, because his ideas did not emerge from abstract philosophy or personal ambition. They were forged in a civilization collapsing under the weight of its own spending. China during the late spring and autumn period and the early warring states era, roughly between the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, was a landscape of fractured kingdoms locked in permanent insecurity. Dozens of states competed for dominance, each convinced it could unify the realm, each pouring more resources into warfare to do so. Alliances formed and shattered with dizzying speed. Armies grew larger with every generation, shifting from aristocratic chariot skirmishes to massive infantry forces that required unprecedented levels of food, metal, labor, taxation, and bureaucracy. War was no longer episodic, it was structural. States were not simply fighting enemies, they were conducting continuous stress tests on their own economies. Every time a ruler mobilized an army, he was effectively taking out a loan against his future. Farmers were pulled from the fields, craftsmen were redirected to weapons production, tax burdens increased, grain reserves were drained, supply lines stretched across vast distances, and far too often these loans came due before victory ever arrived. Western audiences often imagine ancient warfare as tactical, heroic, and personal, but in this era, war was logistical before it was anything else. The moment an army marched, the meter started running. Wagons had to be built, grain had to be transported, horses had to be fed, armorers, blacksmiths, cooks, porters, and scribes all had to be sustained. A campaign lasting several months could bankrupt a small state. A campaign lasting a year could destabilize even a powerful one. And yet, trapped in a cycle of fear and competition, the states kept fighting anyway. This was an arms race long before the modern world invented the term, and it was pushing the entire political order toward collapse. This is the environment Sun Tzu entered, not as a philosopher detached from reality, but as a strategist confronting an economic crisis disguised as a military one. Modern business culture likes to portray him as an ancient CEO whisperer, a thinker obsessed with dominance and competitive advantage. But in truth, Sun Tzu was closer to what we would today call a risk manager. He looked at the numbers, the supply chains, the timelines, the hidden costs, and the long-term consequences. And what he saw terrified him. Victory meant nothing if the treasury collapsed. Territory was meaningless if the state could no longer function. Many rulers believed the enemy's army was their greatest threat. Sun Tzu understood that their own spending habits were far more dangerous. That is why one of the most important lines in The Art of War appears right at the beginning, before deception, before terrain, before morale. He writes, "War is of vital importance to the state. Not glorious, not noble, vital, dangerous, disruptive, capable of destroying the very society it claims to defend." Everything that follows in the text is an explanation of how to keep war contained, controlled, and above all, affordable. Sun Tzu's real obsession was minimizing exposure: financial exposure, social exposure, political exposure. Even his most famous ideas turn out to be economic principles in disguise. When Sun Tzu declares the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, this is not mystical wisdom or poetic idealism, it is cost avoidance. It is the ancient equivalent of achieving strategic goals without burning capital. When he warns that no nation has ever benefited from prolonged warfare, he is stating a literal fiscal reality. The longer a campaign drags on, the more it erodes the state's ability to function. Agricultural output collapses, tax collection weakens, public trust deteriorates. And when Sun Tzu emphasizes speed, intelligence gathering, psychological pressure, and deception, it is because these tools are cheaper than armies. Sun Tzu was not trying to win battles. He was trying to prevent states from bankrupting themselves while attempting to win battles. To grasp how radical this thinking was, you must understand what warfare looked like before him. For centuries, elite aristocrats fought ritualized conflicts where honor mattered more than efficiency, and economic cost barely entered the conversation. War was a stage for prestige. But as populations grew and technology advanced, warfare scaled into something far more destructive. States had to standardize currency, reform taxation, and build bureaucracies simply to sustain their armies. Fighting became a national project and an existential financial risk. Sun Tzu recognized that the old mindset had become suicidal. War could no longer be treated as theater. It had become a balance sheet problem requiring cold, unsentimental analysis. This is what makes Sun Tzu such an anomaly in world history. While most military thinkers glorified combat, he treated war as an accounting exercise. He calculated supply chains, resource depletion, and opportunity costs centuries before those terms existed. He had no patience for generals who chased glory at the expense of stability, because he understood a truth modern leaders often forget. Every decision on the battlefield is ultimately a decision about national solvency. Miscalculate, and you don't just lose soldiers, you lose the state. When you read The Art of War through this economic lens, the book stops sounding like ancient poetry and starts sounding like a spreadsheet written in metaphor. Sun Tzu opens his treatise by listing the 5 fundamental factors that determine the outcome of war: moral influence, heaven, earth, command, and discipline. Beneath the philosophical language lies something far more practical. These are cost variables. He is asking, how stable is your society? How resilient are your people? How predictable is your environment? How competent is your leadership? How efficient is your administration? This is risk assessment in its earliest form. From the very first chapter, Sun Tzu makes clear that leaders who cannot calculate cost have no business calculating strategy. That is why so much of the book focuses on logistics rather than heroics. Sun Tzu devotes an entire section to the economics of feeding an army, and his logic is brutally direct. He explains that when an army operates far from home, the cost of provisions multiplies exponentially. Transporting supplies drains the treasury faster than paying soldiers. Maintaining troops in the field collapses the agricultural labor base. Wasteful commanders, he warns, bankrupt their nations while winning meaningless skirmishes. For a military treatise, The Art of War is remarkably uninterested in actual fighting and obsessively interested in how much fighting costs. Sun Tzu advises rulers to use the enemy's resources whenever possible, not as a tactical trick, but as a fiscal necessity. Every grain sack captured is money saved. Every enemy supply line disrupted reduces your own financial burden. He scolds leaders who prolong campaigns not because they lack courage, but because they are financially reckless. His insight is clear. Logistics do not support strategy. Logistics are strategy. His approach to intelligence reveals the same economic logic. Today, debates about surveillance and intelligence budgets are framed around security, ethics, and national interest. Sun Tzu framed them around efficiency. A single spy, he argued, can prevent an entire army from marching in the wrong direction. A single piece of accurate information can save a nation years of expense. He famously wrote that what enables the wise ruler and the good general to achieve extraordinary results is foreknowledge, not brute force. Foreknowledge is simply the ancient term for data. Sun Tzu recognized that information was the cheapest weapon available. Misallocating information, he understood, was misallocating capital. Even his emphasis on speed is fundamentally economic. Speed is the essence of war, he writes. This is often misread as encouragement for aggression, but Sun Tzu's meaning is subtler. Speed reduces cost. Every day an army remains in the field increases financial exposure. Victory delayed is money burned. Victory achieved through maneuver, deception, and surprise preserves resources. Sun Tzu's preference for flexibility and adaptability is not philosophical flair, it is fiscal discipline. His deepest financial insight, however, is embedded in the structure of the book itself. Every chapter revolves around opportunity cost. Every decision closes off cheaper alternatives. Sun Tzu does not oppose war, he opposes waste. And the greatest waste, in his view, is fighting battles that never needed to be fought. This is why he praises generals who win through diplomacy, intimidation, alliances, and psychological pressure. These are not secondary strategies, they are primary ones because they preserve the state's limited capital. In one of his most revealing warnings, Sun Tzu condemns rulers who enjoy warfare for its own sake. Beneath the poetic language lies a stark accounting principle. If you treat war as passion rather than liability, you will eventually default. History validated this repeatedly. States that poured their wealth into drawn-out sieges hollowed themselves out and became vulnerable to rebellion and collapse. States that applied Sun Tzu's logic, using intelligence, alliances, and swift, decisive actions, avoided economic exhaustion and survived longer. Sun Tzu was not just right in theory, history proved him right in practice. And this is where the story becomes disturbingly modern. Sun Tzu's warnings echo through every major conflict of the last 2 centuries. Modern governments repeatedly enter wars without fully calculating long-term economic strain. They fight on borrowed money, borrowed political capital, and borrowed public trust, and then they watch their systems fracture. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the United States in Vietnam, European empires in World War I. These conflicts were not lost solely because of military weakness. They were lost because the economic model behind them collapsed. Sun Tzu would have recognized the pattern instantly. Prolonged warfare erodes the state faster than the enemy ever could. Meanwhile, the tools Sun Tzu championed, intelligence, deception, targeted operations, psychological pressure, have become central to modern strategy precisely because they are cheaper. Cyber warfare is Sun Tzu. Economic sanctions are Sun Tzu. Proxy wars, covert influence campaigns, strategic deterrence all aim to achieve maximum effect with minimal financial exposure. The world's most powerful states still operate inside Sun Tzu's balance sheet, whether they acknowledge it or not. Perhaps Sun Tzu's most profound contribution is how he reframed national power itself. He understood that strength does not come from armies alone, but from economic resilience, the ability to absorb shocks, recover quickly, and continue functioning. In his era, kingdoms collapsed because they overspent on wars they could not sustain. Today, great powers face the same dilemma under different names: defense budgets, debt burdens, supply chain vulnerabilities, and the long-term cost of projecting force. Sun Tzu might not recognize modern technology, but he would instantly recognize the math. The deeper lesson most people miss is that Sun Tzu was never teaching rulers how to win wars. He was teaching them how to avoid national bankruptcy. His genius lay in understanding that the cost of conflict always outlives the conflict itself. States do not fail because they lose battles. They fail because they drain the capital that keeps them coherent and functional. Victory is meaningless if the treasury collapses afterward. The best war is the one that does not require rebuilding your economy when it ends. Seen through this lens, the art of war becomes something entirely different. It is not a manual of aggression, it is a philosophy of restraint. It does not glorify conquest, it glorifies stability. Sun Tzu admired rulers who preserved resources more than those who conquered cities. He respected generals who won without fighting more than those who destroyed armies. He believed that knowing when not to act was a greater strength than acting out of pride. Sun Tzu's philosophy is not the philosophy of a warrior, it is the philosophy of a steward, someone entrusted with the long-term solvency of a nation. His financial genius lies in his refusal to separate economics from power. He understood that war is the most expensive policy decision a state can make, and miscalculating its cost is a form of suicide. His message is unsettling and timeless. Strength is not measured by how hard you strike, but by how much you can afford to strike. History does not reward the bravest nation, it rewards the most economically disciplined one. History may not repeat, but it walks, and if you don't understand it, it will cost you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers.